So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending. My name's Darcy. I'm the science content developer at Cape Fear Museum. And we are so excited to welcome all of you and to welcome Dana Matics. She is from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She's been there for over 20 years. She started out as a park ranger at Falls Lake and has been in her current role as the Assistant Operations Project Manager over Falls Lake, Jordan Lake, and the 3 Cape Fear River locks and dams for 5 years. So welcome, Dana. We're very excited to hear all about the locks and dams. And I'll go ahead and hand it off to you.
Okay, Darcy, can you just confirm you can hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I'm so happy to be here with you guys. And first, let me apologize. We were supposed to do this earlier in the month. And my second COVID shot knocked me out and I was unable to be here. So I apologize for that, but the museum was so wonderful to let me reschedule it. I'm so glad because I do think this is an important topic. The Cape Fear River locks and dams have a lot of history on the river. So that being said, Darcy told you who I am and what I do. You'll notice I am wearing a uniform. I came up through the park ranger ranks in the Corps of Engineers and will always be a park ranger, though my title has changed for sure. I'm really glad to be able to do this program. It gave me an opportunity to actually learn a little bit about the locks and dams that I didn't know, even though they're in my area. Learned a little bit putting this together, so that was really exciting. There will be time for questions for sure at the end, because honestly, often the best discussion comes from those questions that you guys ask. So I would encourage you to ask questions. Please do not hold back. While I take my job and our mission very seriously, I do not take myself very seriously. So you will not insult me if you ask me a question that is maybe a little off-putting. Please put it in words and let's talk about it. All that being said, if I don't know the answer to the question, I'm not going to make it up. I'm going to let you know that, but we can always communicate after the fact. I'm going to leave my email and phone number up on the very last slide. So if there's something that I can't answer and you want to reach back out to me, please do so. This is talking to folks and getting information out is the best part of my job and something I really enjoy. So all that being said, let's get started. Let me get my presentation back up here and I believe you guys can see my very first slide. So we're going to discuss today past, present, and future of our Cape Fear locks and dams. The first couple slides do have a lot of words, which I hate, but they're pretty important because we need to get kind of a baseline and be sure we're all on the same page as far as what we're talking about. So here we have a picture of just the Cape Fear River Basin. Many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with it. Couple statistics, the Deep and the Haw rivers come together just about 4 miles below Jordan Lake Dam, which was built in the late 70s, early 80s to create the Cape Fear. The Rocky River feeds into the Deep River, I believe, a little ways up as well. So that point where Deep and Haw come together is called Mermaid Point. And from Mermaid Point to Wilmington, it's about 200 miles. So a fairly good stretch of river. As a matter of fact, the Cape Fear River Basin is the largest river basin in the state with just over 9,000 square miles. So it's quite big. Touches 26 counties. And of course, at the top end where I'm sitting right now is Beaver Jordan Lake. I sit here at the dam most days here at Jordan Lake. And then on downstream below Fayetteville, all encompassed within Bladen County, are Lock and Dam 3, also called William O. Husk, Lock and Dam 2, just outside of Elizabethtown, and Lock and Dam 1 in Regalwood. So now that we have an overview of where we are and where we're positioned in the river basin itself, let's do a little history, because there's actually a huge amount of history to cover in these locks and dams, and I've kind of just touched the highlights. Very, very, very long history of commerce and need for navigation in the Cape Fear. And our involvement, the Corps of Engineers involvement, started back in the late 1800s when the federal government actually purchased the claims to the Cape Fear River and navigation within it. And at that point, we began clearing snags. So we started kind of very low key, just clearing snags and debris within the river. In 1885, Congress stepped in and said, no, that's not good enough. We need some commerce between Wilmington and Fayetteville. So Corps of Engineers, we want you to create a 4-foot channel between Wilmington and Elizabethtown, and then a 3-foot channel all the way to Fayetteville from Elizabethtown. So if any of you are familiar with the river, that is not a lot of draft. So there's not a lot of expectation of large barges coming up at that point. But granted, it's the late 1800s. there has been drama from day one on this river and the Corps of Engineers efforts in it. Honestly, the very first season, they did any kind of clearing and any kind of dredging, trying to keep that 4-foot and 3-foot channel open. One freshet, which is a pulse of high water in the spring, basically from a spring storm, one freshet could knock out an entire season worth of work. So an entire season worth of money and effort. So it was very apparent very quickly that this was not going to be an easy task, and we needed to go back and look and figure out a better way to do this other than just dredging a channel. So finally in 1903, the Rivers and Harbors Act provided funding to continue to study the river and secured money for 3 actual locks and dams, which are the ones we have now. One at Kings Bluff, which is 39 miles upstream from Wilmington. So that's lock and dam 1. The second at Brown's Landing, which is 71 miles up from Wilmington. And the third at Toller's Landing, which is 95 miles up from Wilmington. So 1903, we said, Congress said, Corps of Engineers, 3 locks and dams sounds like a good idea. Let's move out. Well, Congress may have thought it was a good idea, but apparently folks within the Corps of Engineers locally may not have thought it was a good use of public funding. So again, drama from day one in the Cape Fear and the Corps of Engineers involvement in it. The quote I have up here is from a division commander. Our higher ups are all colonels and generals. So this would have been a general at the time out of the Southeast. And he said straight out, I doubt very much if this river is worthy of improvement by locks and dams. There was a lot of controversy, kind of the, if we build it, will they come theory. You know, yes, the river was being used for commerce. Was it enough commerce though to sink $1 million or however much it was going to take to build 3 locks and dams and the infrastructure in it, and then continue to dredge every year? You know, did the cost benefit work out, basically, was the Corps of Engineers' concern at the time. The other issues were the river is already paralleled by railroads. So using those for commerce, does that give us competition in the river? And again, is the cost worth it? There were also those who argued that Fayetteville was not going to be this hub of commerce that folks thought it might be. So that is kind of where we were at in the early 1900s, and got it down to basically 1910. Bottom line was 2 locks and dams were approved and funded based on the Corps of Engineers recommendation back to Congress. That was Lock and Dam 1 at Kings Bluff and Lock and Dam 2 at Brown's Landing. So the interesting thing was Fayetteville was not super happy with that. And so we'll get into that in just a minute. So I do have some very cool, very cool old photos of some of the construction. So in 1912, construction on Lock and Dam 1 started. So this is a picture of setting sheet pile for the dam. You have to basically build temporary dams with sheet pile. They're called coffer dams, to have an area to work in the dry. But there were major issues. They set a bunch of sheet pile, pumped out an area to work in the dry. And as soon as they started kind of digging around in the riverbed, 2 springs sprung up and filled up the area they had just pumped out within a day. So lots of hurdles to jump through in the Cape Fear, even just getting these things in place once they were approved. This is a successful coffer dam. So as you guys can see, this interior portion, now that it's kind of fenced off with these sheet piles, would be pumped out, and then we would work and pour concrete in the dry in here. So eventually things worked out. This is a completed coffer dam. And once those completed coffer dams are put in, they would pour concrete and continue on with construction. This is a really, really neat photo, I think. And some of the things I want you guys to take note of here. So this is the interior of our lock chamber. So this is where a boat or barge would be locked through. Typically, this is going to be filled with water. So it's a very unique perspective here, as if we were standing on top of a lock wall. This was actually a little later on this was not during construction, this was during a modification, but it's a great picture I wanted to show anyway. And you guys can see there's a person bent over here. So a little bit of scale, a guy standing here. These are what we call our miter gates. There's 4 of them, 2 on either end. And those are what literally swing open and then close to let boats through. At the bottom of each miter gate, there's a series of openings, and they have valve covers on them that flip up and down that are controlled from the top. And those are what we call our fill valves. So that's how we fill or empty the chamber to equalize the pressure. So if we want a boat to come in and be locked upstream, We would lower the level of water in the chamber, open those lower gates, let the boat in, shut the lower gates, and then we would open some of these valves at the top end to let the water level rise and fill up to whatever the river height of upstream is. Once that's equalized between upstream and within the chamber, we would open those miter gates up top and let the boat out. Very simple process, really only takes about 30 minutes or so, but just still an engineering marvel to my mind, especially when we consider the time frame that these were built in. And just an example of one of our lockmaster houses. You have locks, you have to have people to run them, right? So this is an example. This is Kings Bluff, so this would be Lock and Dam 1. So this is one of the 2 lockmaster houses that were built at number 1, and then the ones at number 2 were almost exactly the same, but elevated, were set up higher on pilings. So this house is still standing today. This is our existing, what we use for an office space for our 1 employee that works at our Lock and Dam number 1. Life of a lockmaster was tough. So there were typically 2 on site because you work 12-hour shifts, because lockages happened 24/7, didn't matter the time of day, rain, sleet, snow, kind of like the post office. If a barge is coming upstream, the lockmaster is expected to be there and to lock a ship, lock whatever it is through, whether that be on a beautiful May afternoon with the sun shining or at 2 a.m. in January with it sleeting. Either way. So they lived on site and worked those 12-hour shifts. It was a pretty tough life. They were pretty tough folks. So all that being said, we constructed number 1 and number 2, and in 1915, the very first vessel was locked through at number 1. This picture is labeled as if this is the first vessel that was locked through. I don't know if that's the case or not. We could all just pretend it is, and that's fine. It's still a very, very cool picture of at least one of the early boats that came through the lock at number 1. 1917, so just 2 years later, Lock and Dam 2 was completed. Far less issues with construction. We learned a lot at number 1 that we applied at number 2. So 2 years later, 1970, Lock and Dam 2 was finished. And I realized about 20 minutes ago that I didn't have a picture in here of what one looks like today. So I scavenged very quickly for an aerial photo of one of our locks and dams. And this is actually Lock and Dam 3, William O. Husk. But this is what one looks like today. Very similar to what they look like when they were completed. But again, I'll point out these. So this is upstream, and here's the dam across. And then boats would come through the navigation channel here. These upper gates will open, let the boat in, they close. We open the valves down here to lower the water level down to whatever it is below the dam. Once that equalizes, these gates open and the boat goes on out and through. Again, a very simple process. But we'll talk a little bit about the challenges we have both now and ahead of us because of the age of infrastructure and just the river itself, essentially. All right, so back to our history lesson. 2 down, Lock and Dam 1, Lock and Dam 2, done, right? 1 to go. So Fayetteville continued to push that they needed a Lock and Dam 3 close to them. The Corps of Engineers said, no, we can just dredge it and keep that channel clear. So Congress authorized the Corps to dredge an 8-foot channel as a test to see if it was possible. As you might expect, it was not a good thing. Another quote here, which I love, it says, the whole river bottom is alive during a freshet. Again, a freshet is that pulse of water we get in the spring from spring rains, and the sand is constantly moving. The project, meaning the dredging, was utterly hopeless by this means of improvement. So basically, bottom line is that our district at the time decided, look, we can't keep the channel open above number 2 with just dredging. We need a 3rd lock if the state of North Carolina and the federal government want this commerce to succeed. So 1922, we did another study to see if a 3rd lock and dam was needed. And at the time it was decided, no, we would just modify number 1 and number 2. Fayetteville pushed again. And finally, in 1930, Lock and Dam number 3 was approved. The question is, why now? So I did a little digging and found out that that same year, first of all, there was the Great Depression going on, right? So I think at that point, anything the government was doing to put people to work was probably sped along and moved along fairly quickly. So any projects that might have been sitting on the shelf may have come to light during this time. But second, and maybe more importantly, I don't know, at this point in 1930 was when the inland waterway was to be completed between Beaufort and Wilmington. So that opened up essentially a whole new world and then a direct link all the way then to Wilmington, or excuse me, all the way then to Fayetteville if we could get Lock and Dam 3 built. So that happened under Colonel Snow at the time. And so anyone in Wilmington familiar with Snow's Cut, that's that opening that allowed Beaufort to Wilmington. And then subsequently it was decided that, well, if we did that part, we might as well put in Lock and Dam 3 as well and really complete the entire system. So 1930, Lock and Dam 3 was approved. 1934, we got some more construction photos. So construction began. What you all are looking at is as if you're standing, this is the dam at Lock and Dam 3. It was a concrete dam, so it was 1930s. And this is the actual bottom of the lock chamber itself. And you can see some of our workers down in there. The bottoms of all of the lock chambers are actually timber. So they're not concrete. They have concrete sills where the gates sit, but the interior is just wood, which is fascinating to me. All that wood sitting down there in the bottom of the Cape Fear River, and still very, very solid. The 1936, the first cargo made it all the way through all 3 locks and dams, and it was a load of gas and kerosene, which is really ironic considering we're going through a gas shortage today, right? There was a party when the barge got up to Wilmington, or got up to Lock and Dam 3, and it was led by William O. Husk. And again, that name may sound familiar because Lock and Dam 3 is named after him. He was the president of the Upper Cape Fear River Improvement Association. And apparently he was a pretty squeaky wheel, it sounds like, for the government and for the Wilmington District Corps of Engineers. As a matter of fact, he was very excited that we put in Lock and Dam 3, but we were not in the clear. I mean, let's be real. Again, the Cape Fear River is a beast to try to get a hold of, and we've been trying to harness it for a long time now. So channel problems continued. We had our 3 locks and dams, but how do you measure success? Stuff, commerce was going up and down, but the channel was a nightmare to keep clear, basically. And from my understanding, Mr. William O. Husk earned quite the reputation as being a squeaky wheel directly to our district commander at the time, letting him know every time there was a problem in the river, and we would jump right on it and do the best we could to, to clear the snag or where the channel filled in or whatever it was. So still a very tough job for us. And that is how Mr. Husk, or O. Husk, earned his namesake at Lock and Dam 3. We did decide to name Lock and Dam 3 after him. I believe in the early mid-60s is when that was done. So yes, locks and dams are here. Commerce is moving. We still have channel problems, keeping the channel clear. And we had, I think, maybe unexpected impacts to the fisheries. And so that's what we're going to start to focus on here. So we were successful with commerce, but unfortunately we all but stopped the migratory fish who live in the ocean, come upstream to spawn. So we're talking shad, sturgeon. In this day and age, we talk about striped bass as well. So prior to 1916, I found a really great stat. Fayetteville residents caught thousands of shad each spring. And if any of you guys have fished in the Cape Fear, man, people even today still go crazy for those American shad when they run. So spring of 1916, though, after Lock and Dam 1 was completed, Fayetteville residents caught 7 shad as opposed to the thousands they had caught previously. So obviously the Lock and Dam was an impediment to those fish. Shouldn't come as a surprise. I don't know whether it did or not, but regardless, I think at that time we did not perhaps take in environmental impacts into our account as much as we do today. As a matter of fact, I know we didn't. So there was a move to try to help these fish get upstream, right? We've stopped them, we need to now help them. So there were some modifications done to Lock and Dam 1 and 2. Those were fish ladders, and that's what you're looking at here. The spikes or the bolts you see sticking up are just part of the form for the concrete. Those would have either been concreted over or cut off after the fact. But essentially they're pools that the fish jump one to another and get up over the dam that way. They were added to the lock structure itself. Those were a really good idea for the Pacific Northwest, where they were used for salmon. Unfortunately, I don't know if you guys know much about shad. They tend to be, the word I read was sluggish, which reads to me, I guess they tend to be a little lazy. They're not used to jumping and they're not going to do it. So the fish ladders that we added in the 30s to Lock and Dam 1 and 2, into 3 as well, didn't work, basically. There were a couple other ideas that I read about. As a matter of fact, it sounds like the Corps of Engineers worked even with local residents to find out how to get the fish upstream. You know, this was a big deal to a lot of people. And I'm going to read this because it's it's a little long and I want to get it right. There was one particular resident suggested using the lock chamber to catch shad and move them, which is actually something we do now. But he suggested we string a net partially across the lock chamber to kind of trap them in, and then use a pole to bang on the bottom of the lock chamber to, I assume, create sound waves under the water that would effectively herd the fish upstream. And he suggested doing this once an hour on the hour during spawning season, which is a lot. Spawning season is usually several months long. So fascinating, and it's awesome that we tried it. The Corps of Engineers said, yeah, let's give it a shot. And it didn't work. That being said, the idea of locking fish through did come to fruition a little later down the road, and is something we still do or still have done today, just not with the pole banging on the bottom of the chamber. It kind of reminds me of a shepherd kind of herding sheep. It's just a funny image to me. So we know we have a struggle with the fishery now. We know we have done a good job with commerce, but we have negatively impacted fish. We've tried these fish ladders to really no success. So fast forward a long way in the future to our fish passage that we have today. So at Lock and Dam 1, this is a picture of Lock and Dam 1 prior to our fish passage coming in. So it's called a rock arch rapids. And locking fish through, we discovered, is okay. And we've been doing that since the, I don't know, I think 70s, maybe even earlier than that, as just a way to get fish upstream. But ton of partners involved in the rock arch rapids effort. So basically, let me get to my next slide so we can see. The rock arch rapids were designed and built with a huge amount of stakeholders, a huge amount of partners. As a matter of fact, local, state, federal, nonprofits, far too many to even mention. This work was done in 2012, only at Lock and Dam 1 so far. This was the first of its kind in the eastern part of the United States, so it was a big deal. And it was designed for shad, striped bass, and hopefully sturgeon, even though they're endangered and not too many of them around, to use and get upstream and essentially get over Lock and Dam 1. The short nose and Atlantic sturgeon were of specific importance to the federal government because they're a federally endangered species. But we do recognize the importance of the striped bass and certainly the shad for sport fishermen, and the importance to the state. So this is an example of a barge that was moved into the river. And literally you can see an excavator in the river moving rocks around to set these in place. I've got a better picture. Here we go. So you can see this is where the rock arch rapids is almost completely done. And they are literal tiers of rocks, almost steps of rocks that provide smaller, shorter pools for fish to rest in. They don't quite have to jump quite so high as they might in the fish ladders themselves. You can see this excavator here. The placement of these rocks was so precise that, from my understanding, there was a GPS unit put on the boom on the end of the excavator so that it would pick up a rock and place it in the literal exact location it was supposed to be placed in, so that these were set just so. It was a huge effort, and mostly successful. This is another picture. So this is an aerial shot of what it looks like now. And this is a really great shot where you can see all the layers of rock and how the flow happens. And then some of these smaller pictures are close-ups of the resting pools and kind of the levels that the fish can go up in this. So successful for sure for the American shad, not so much for the striped bass. And then we think successful for the sturgeon too, but there's not a lot of sturgeon in the river at this point. So we have caught some, or not we, but state and nonprofits have caught some sturgeon and tagged some sturgeon above Lock and Dam 1. So the assumption is they use the rock arch rapids to go up and over. So successful, but interestingly enough, we are actually, the Cape Fear River Watch has secured grant funding to modify this structure to hopefully make it even more successful for our fish, including the stripers. So a lot of lessons learned, I think, in building this, being the one of the first on the East Coast. So there are going to be some adjustments made. So over the next few months, over the summer, we will actually be shutting down public access to Lock and Dam 1 for a little while they come back in. Probably not add a huge amount of stone, but it will be more moving stones around to hopefully make this even more successful. And then maybe even one day, the thought is be able to add one to number 2 and possibly even one to number 3 as well. We'll see what the future holds for us. We do have continued challenges at the Cape Fear, at our locks and dams. I don't have to tell you guys about flooding. Oh my gosh, flooding has always been a challenge in the Cape Fear, but it seems like really since Florence, or even before that, since about 2016, seems like there have been worse flooding, more floods and worse flooding. So it's a huge challenge for us. This is a picture of Lock and Dam 2 after a high water event, and you can see the trees just laying across the upper gates. So we have to go clear those, cut them, try to safely move them. We still have challenges with channel depth. Many years ago, the Corps of Engineers, when commerce stopped, which is about 1995, was the last commercial barge that came through. The Corps of Engineers no longer maintains the channel. There's no funding for it, and it's kind of a vicious cycle. There's no commercial traffic. This was put there for commercial. These were put there for commercial traffic and funded for commercial traffic. But if there is none, then you don't get funding for it. And if you don't get funding for it, you can't maintain things, and so you end up in this cycle of our reality now. Fish passage success, I already talked about. They are going to alter the existing one and possibly add to number 2 and number 3. That's a ways down the road, I think. Aging infrastructure. I started with history. These locks, 2 of them are well over 100 years old. One of them is, 80 some years old. They are tough, well-made, mechanical, marvels. But if you don't use them, like anything mechanical, it starts to break down, and that's where we're at now. Current state is not great. Currently, Lock and Dam 1 is functional, 95%. So we can lock boats through at number 1. We don't very often. Occasional Wildlife Commission gets locked through, other state agencies. Very seldom a recreational boater will come through. But number 2 and number 3 have simply never recovered, even from Florence. The debris and the damage and our current levels of funding just simply will not allow us to catch back up. So it's kind of, our lack of funding is unfortunately kind of caught up with us. So I hate to paint a dreary picture, but it's the truth. This is a really great example of the flooding. This was Hurricane Florence. This was pre-Hurricane Florence. This is Lock and Dam 2. And then this is what it looked like after Florence. And again, if you guys are local, I don't have to wow you with these pictures. I'm sure you lived your own reality during those times. So our current state's not great. Our future was, or our past was kind of drama filled. And what about our future? If you guys have been around for very long, you've probably heard us talk about a disposition study that the Corps of Engineers did. What does that even mean? Well, a disposition study is to determine whether there's federal interest in these pieces of infrastructure anymore. Remember, they were authorized for navigation, commercial navigation, and we haven't had that since 1995. So all indications are that there is no federal interest, but where does that leave us? Well, exactly where we are right now. Congress has to make that decision that there is no federal interest and we need to dispose of them. But we need to have a willing entity to take them if all those decisions line up and fall into place. So that's a big question mark for us. We're kind of in this limbo now. We have just enough funding to pay our 2 employees that do the best they can to maintain the grounds, keep the place clean, do minor repairs as best we can, but we don't have enough money to get these locks to where they used to be. And if there's no need for them, maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not. That's for, you guys to decide, honestly. So definitely kind of in a weird spot. And I hated when I created this program, I hated leaving this here because it seems like such a Debbie Downer moment. And I don't mean it to be. My folks who work at Locks and Dams do amazing work and do the best they can with what we give them to work with, and are dedicated to these. I couldn't ask for two better employees that work at these Locks and Dams. And they're so dedicated and want these areas to succeed. But we're in kind of a tough spot. And if any of you guys have been to the Locks and Dams, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't have to tell you. We're not what we used to be, and I'm not entirely sure where we're headed, but we'll figure it out and do the best we can until then. So I have kind of flown through a lot of information. I try to keep it at 30 minutes, or real close to it. That way I give you guys time for questions. This is my email and my phone number, I promise. If you want to jot those down, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to any of you or anybody at any point in time about locks and dams, or I also cover falls like in Jordan Lake as well. So if you have questions about those areas, I'm happy to help you. So again, I've just thrown a lot of information at you, a lot of history, a little bit about our present, what I know about our future. So I guess, Darcy or Barbie, at this point, I would open it up to any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you so much, Dana. That was wonderful. We do have a couple of questions. Our first one is, with no commercial traffic, few recreational boaters, no money, etc., need for fish moving upstream in a more environmentally sound approach, what's the thought on returning the Cape Fear to being a wild river?
It's a really good question. So this gets very, very complicated. It shouldn't be, right? It seems so simple. We'll just take them out. If we don't need them anymore, they don't get funding, let's just demo them and be gone. And there are many folks who would agree with that. The problem is there are water intakes above all three of them technically, but specifically above number one is Wilmington's water supply, and much of New Hanover County's water supply comes from right behind Lock and Dam 1. And then Fayetteville, including Fort Bragg, their water supply comes from right behind number 3. So while these are not very tall dams, they're average 10 feet, 11 feet, something like that, they do create enough of a pool in the river and raise the river level just enough to give additional water supply storage to those municipalities. So many of you folks who are sitting right there are probably drinking water from the Cape Fear that has been pulled, from behind Lock and Dam 1. So if we remove those locks and dams, that water level in the river will drop, and that could very well jeopardize some of that water supply. So while the water supply is not what they were intended for, that's a secondary benefit and a pretty important one too. So it's not that easy. It is rather complicated, but I love that question. Thank you for asking that.
Another question, does the water move through the lock strictly by gravity, or are there also pumps involved?
Nope, it is free flowing. So as long as the gates are open. Now the water moves over the dam, just gravity and typical water is going where it's going to go, path of least resistance. And if the gates are open, say if we open the upper gates, the lock chamber will fill up to the level of the river above the dam. And then if we open a few lower valves on the bottom, we'll have some water flow through, but not enough to kind of drain the pool behind it. So it's all gravity. There is no pump. And as a matter of fact, we've even had occasionally when there's severe flooding in the Cape Fear, we've had panicked phone calls of, oh my gosh, the Lock and Dam 1 is gone. Well, no, it's just completely underwater, which is scary, but it's still there. Or, oh my gosh, shut the gates at the locks and dams, you're flooding us. Well, they're what we call run of the river projects. They have, those dams are only 10 feet tall. They are what they are. There is no other means to control that water level coming over them, essentially. Good question.
Yeah. So I think this one might have been answered, or was a follow-up. It says, what happens to the water supply if the locks and dams are removed?
If you can answer that, we will solve lots of problems. That is, as I said with my answer to the first one, that is, that's one of our biggest impediments to just saying, you know, hey, Congress, we're done with these. There is no federal interest in removing them. It's simply not that easy. A lot of folks would have to find a different water supply, and that is a challenge.
What happened in 1995 that stopped commercial traffic from coming through the locks and dams? Oh, she may have frozen. We may have lost you for a minute. Hopefully you'll come back.
Oh, that's a good one. There's a couple, the Corps actually shut down the, well, I'm sorry, what? All right, how about now? Am I there?
Yes, you're back.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna turn off my video just to be sure you can hear me. Sometimes our internet connection isn't great. In the 1990s, mid 1990s, we actually shut the locks and dams down to do some major overhaul. And so we may have partially done it to ourselves, but at the time it needed to be done. They were very, very old. We needed major rehab. You know, I-40 opened up at some point in the fairly recent past, and that made a huge difference to commerce. So between I-40, the railroads that were existing, and then, you know, us shutting down to do rehab and maintenance, I think people discovered that maybe river commerce was not what it was all that cracked up to be. And I think it was a combination of all those things, honestly. But 95 was our last commercial navigation that came through.
Okay. Who opens and closes the gates now, and does it have to be scheduled? We may have lost you again.
It does. I think you're breaking up a little bit, Darcy, but I think you asked who opens the gates. How about now? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Our lock and dam equipment mechanics, I have one at number 1 and one at number 3. They work all 3 of them. They are the ones who open and close the gates. And yes, we do ask that you give them a call to schedule a lockage. And currently that can only be done at number 1. No more 24/7 like back in the day. We do ask that you schedule them.
Yeah. Okay. Our next question is, do the dams provide any flood control?
No, they do not provide any flood control of anything to speak of. Again, they're low head dams. They're 10, 11 feet tall. So I guess in theory, yes, maybe a little bit, but not simply by their existence. But no, not in our. They don't provide flood control like Jordan Dam does or Falls does.
All right, those are all of the questions that we currently have. If you have any more questions, go ahead and chat them or type them in the chat box now. And we will get to them. So we'll just give it another few minutes to see if anybody has any follow-up questions. But while we're waiting for that, I just want to say thank you so much. This was fascinating. I learned a lot. And that rock rapid, the rock rapid is very cool. And it's good to hear that that's working for some fish species that the salmon ladders don't quite work for. Okay, one final question. Is there a replay access location?
Right, yeah.
We are recording this, and so we will post it on the website. And if you're registered for this, we can send out a link to the recording as well. So. All right, well, I think that about covers it. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Again, Dana, thank you so much for coming, and to all of our attendees, thank you for joining us this afternoon for this program, and we hope you really enjoyed it. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Dana.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was great. Thank you, Darcy.
Thanks.